This is the last section in this third week. So here we go. In Model 3, I want to be talking about the therapist's failures as inevitable because of the force field, necessary so that there can be opportunity, and therefore even desirable. And again, Model 3, it's tricky. Model 3, you got to be able to be on top of your game. You got to be on top of your game actually in all three models. But Model 3 is something that is the model that's most difficult for most therapists. I would say. Okay, contemporary relational theory postulates that it is not only inevitable because of the force field, but also necessary, and therefore desirable, for the therapist ultimately to fail the patient, and to do it repeatedly, and in the very ways that the patient most needs to be failed if she is ever to have the opportunity to modify her toxic introjects and their negative self-sabotaging voices. So when the patient says, I just hate myself, on some level, usually it's not just insight into that and why she has it, Model 1, that's going to help her to be less hating herself, but rather when she's got those charged toxic boluses that are being played out internally, I hate myself, the most effective and efficient way to modify their toxicity and the venomous hatred is by delivering it into the treatment and inviting the therapist to lend her own more evolved capacity to process and integrate what the patient has found just unassimilable and too much to tolerate, too much to bear. Okay. Now, if the therapist never allows herself to be drawn in to participating with the patient in her dramatic reenactments, we speak of a failure of engagement and lost opportunity. It's not the end of the world, but color the therapist impermeable. She's not allowing herself to participate in a mutual enactment. She's afraid. She doesn't want to be seen as bad. She doesn't want to participate as bad, even some watered-down version of bad. But as a result, she's robbing the patient of the opportunity to modify their dynamic of hating and hated. So if the therapist never allows herself to be drawn into participating with the patient in her dramatic reenactments, we speak of a failure of engagement and lost opportunity. On the other hand, if the therapist allows herself to be drawn in to the patient's internal dramas, but then gets overwhelmed, loses her way, and cannot find her way out, color her really permeable, whereas in the first instance of failure of engagement, color her impermeable. So color this therapist totally permeable, instead of the more optimal balance of semi-permeable. All right. So if the therapist allows herself to be drawn into the patient's internal dramas, but then gets overwhelmed, loses her way, and cannot find her way out, we speak of a failure of containment and the potential for re-traumatization. The Model 3 relational therapist must therefore be able to provide containment, which is what I've been basically talking about all along when I talk about the therapist brings to bear her own more evolved capacity to process and integrate. The therapist must ultimately be able to relent and to hold herself accountable. In essence, the relational therapist must be able to provide, she must have the capacity, the adaptive capacity to provide containment. She must be able not only to tolerate being made into the patient's old bad object. That's hard enough. But also, once the therapist has indeed allowed herself to be drawn in to participating in what has become a mutual enactment, she must be able to extricate herself by stepping back, which will enable her to recover her objectivity and thereby her therapeutic effectiveness. And that's containment. So not only must she be able to tolerate being made into the patient's old bad object, but also must be able to extricate herself by stepping back once she has been drawn into participating in that mutual enactment. The net result of which is that she will be able to recover her objectivity and thereby her therapeutic effectiveness. And in order to provide effective containment, as we've been saying all along, the therapist must have the capacity to relent. How can we ever be expecting the patient to have the capacity to relent, whether more obviously in Model 2 or even on some level in Model 3, if we ourselves are unable or refuse to relent? In other words, the therapist must have both the wisdom to recognize and the integrity to acknowledge, certainly to herself and perhaps to the patient as well. And we'll talk a little more in the next hour, because this is our last section in this hour, this week. And we'll talk about what the therapist does and doesn't acknowledge of her countertransferential reaction to the patient. But the therapist, in any event, to provide effective containment, must have both the wisdom to recognize and the integrity to acknowledge, certainly to herself, perhaps to the patient as well, her own participation in the drama that is being played out between them on the stage of the treatment. In essence, the therapist must have the capacity both to relent and to hold herself accountable for her enactments. Please note that although the emphasis to this point has been on paired pathogenic introjects, the result of dysfunctional early on relational dynamics, and then on negotiating at the intimate edge to detoxify the pathogenicity of the pathogenic introjects, and with the patient identifying with either the more passive pole, like victim, or the more active pole, like victimizer, either can happen, of the introjective configuration, again reference to William Meissner, and then in identifying with one pole, whether passive or active, then projecting onto the therapist the complementary pole. So that's what it's been to this point, the emphasis. But I want to highlight now an additional point, that Model 3 also involves the therapist's use of self to modify the pathogenicity of unpaired toxic boluses that the patient has not yet been able to assimilate into healthy psychic structure. Now I'm not talking about pairs, I'm talking about unpaired toxic boluses, like tremendous guilt, tremendous shame, that the patient has not been able to process and integrate and assimilate, and instead is sort of disowning and projecting and putting into the therapist. So it's not always simply pairs, and one pole gets projected, one pole gets identified with, and the other one is projected. Sometimes it's simply a charged toxic bolus of guilt or rage or feelings of inadequacy that the patient has not yet been able to assimilate. So for example, overwhelming rage, excoriating guilt, or intolerably painful grief. And basically the patient's going to borrow the therapist and the therapist's more evolved capacity to process and integrate it for the patient, and then to return that to the patient for reintrojection, now more assimilable into the patient's psychic structure. I'm going to wrap up this week by sharing a clinical vignette about the sharing of grief. And again, when we hear the word grief or grieving, that doesn't necessarily mean only Model 2. In Model 3, and I'm going to give you an example now, a little clinical vignette, where the word grief becomes relevant as well. All right, a patient's beloved grandmother has just died. The patient, unable to feel his sadness because it hurts too much, recounts in a monotone the details of his grandmother's death. So the whole vignette is this page. Let me start over again. So please listen carefully to each word, because then I'm going to explain the different parts of it. A patient's beloved grandmother has just died. The patient, unable to feel his sadness because it hurts too much, recounts in a monotone the details of his grandmother's death. As the therapist listens, she becomes very sad. As the patient continues, of course he's recounting it in a monotone, but the therapist becomes very sad. As the patient continues, the therapist finds herself uttering, almost inaudibly, an occasional, "Oh no," and "That's awful." As the hour progresses, the patient himself becomes increasingly sad. That's it. It happened in a heartbeat. Well, it happened in one session. Okay. I would like to suggest I think it's a beautiful example of projective identification, but not now where we're talking about pairs of pathogenic introjects, but about an unpaired charged toxic bolus of unprocessed and disowned, disavowed grief, because it's too much for the patient to process, integrate, and adapt to, and instead the patient defends by disowning and projecting. Okay, so in this example, the patient is initially unable to feel the depths of his grief about the grandmother's death. But by reporting the details in the monotonic manner in which he does, the patient is able to get the therapist to feel what he himself cannot, and instead must defend against. In essence, the patient is exerting interpersonal pressure upon the therapist to take on as the therapist's own what the patient does not yet have the capacity to tolerate. As the therapist sits with the patient and listens to his story, she finds herself becoming very sad, which signals the therapist's quiet acceptance of the patient's disavowed grief. Now, I know I said finds herself, but I don't mean to be suggesting defensively. It really is adaptive capacity. I know I did say finds herself, but all right. Let's just say she becomes very sad, which signals the therapist's quiet acceptance of the patient's charged toxic bolus of disavowed grief. This would be the induction phase. Well, maybe I do want to say she finds herself. All right. This would be the induction phase of the projective identification. We could say of the patient's sadness that it has found its way into the therapist, who, able to tolerate what the patient finds intolerable, takes it on as her own. We could say of the patient's sadness that it has found its way into the therapist, who then takes it on as her own. The therapist's sadness is therefore co-created. In part, a story about the patient and his disavowed grief that he has put into her and she has accepted. That's the induction phase of the projective identification. And in part, a story about the therapist, in whom, it would seem, a resonant chord has been struck. So the therapist's sadness is therefore co-created. Story about the here and now of the therapeutic engagement, and a story about the therapist's there and then, a story about her past. So it's both a story about the present, the here and now, and a story about the there and then of the therapist, the patient, the therapist's past. So it's co-created. Let's see, I was going to say one other thing. Oh, yes. So I'm going to be making a point, I hope I make it soon, that this is not a story about empathy. This is a story about authenticity, whereby the therapist brings to bear her authentic self. She allows the patient's experience to enter into her. Remember, I defined authenticity in this way. Empathy involves decentering, the therapist decentering from her own experience and entering into the patient's experience, taking it on as if it were her own, but it doesn't become her own. In Model 3, authenticity, the therapist allows the patient's experience to come into her, and she then takes it on as her own. So her experience then is co-created, in part a story about the patient and in part a story about the therapist. This is authenticity at its best. Okay. The therapist, still the same example, with her greater capacity to experience affect without needing to defend against it, that's what the patient does, is able both to tolerate the sadness that the patient finds intolerable and to process and integrate it. This ushers in the resolution phase of the projective identification. The therapist feels it, but is not overwhelmed by it. So color her semi-permeable. She's not impermeable. She's not totally permeable and taken over by it, but rather color her semi-permeable. She feels it, but is not overwhelmed by the patient's toxic bolus of grief. It is then the therapist's ability to tolerate the intolerable that makes the patient's previously unmanageable feelings more manageable for him. Indeed, the patient's grief becomes less terrifying by virtue of the fact that the therapist has been able to carry that grief on the patient's behalf. A more assimilable version of the patient's sadness is then returned to the patient in the form of the therapist's heartfelt utterances, "Oh no," and "That's awful," such that the patient finds himself now able to bear the pain of his own grief, now able to carry that pain on his own behalf, now able to tolerate what had once been intolerable, because it has now been modified, detoxified, made less charged and toxic, such that what gets reintrojected is now more manageable, less toxic, can now be assimilated into the patient's psychic structure. And what had been toxic is now much less toxic. What had been disowned can now be owned, and one can hold oneself accountable. So from reenacting on the stage of the treatment this charged toxic bolus unpaired, to accountability, taking ownership, being able to hold oneself responsible for the now more tolerable, less toxic, less charged, less intolerable bolus of grief. All right, this is the last slide for the week. This vignette, I'm repeating what I'd earlier explained, and this is important to me that I get this said. This vignette about the patient with the grandmother who had died, and it reports in a monotone the details of her death, but by the end of the session, the patient himself is able to tolerate the pain of his upset and his grief. He's still very, very sad, but he can tolerate it. He can take ownership of it. He can hold himself accountable for it. All right, this is an example of the therapist's authenticity, the therapist's authentic use of self to facilitate the therapeutic process, the intersubjective dynamic going on between patient and therapy. And it's not specifically a story about the therapist's empathy. In other words, I am speaking here to the distinction between taking on the patient's unassimilated experience as the therapist's own, which is what is happening in this example, happening in this Model 3 example, and taking on the patient's unassimilated experience only as if it were her own, which is what happens in Model 2. And I remember some years ago, I hope I won't offend anybody here by talking about the Red Sox versus the Yankees, but I remember when our Red Sox won and the World Series and the New York Yankees lost, and I had a patient who was totally and completely and absolutely a New York Yankees fan, and she came in the next day absolutely devastated. empathically, I was able, for the moment, as in the interest of the treatment, and because my sense was she needed that, the point of emotional urgency was her needing me to be resonating empathically with her experience of devastation that her Yankees had lost. I decentered from my own ecstasy and delight, and having stayed up practically the whole night celebrating, I decentered from that and joined alongside her, taking on her experience of upset and distress and devastation as if it were my own, and I was able to say things like that it was absolutely devastating for her. I didn't say it sounds as if it was or it must have been. I just said it was absolutely devastating when at the end there, just by the sheer the Yankees lost, so painful, absolutely devastating. And she felt absolutely held and understood. And I did that by not letting my countertransferential delight and joy about the Red Sox having won. I didn't let that. I decentered from that. So I didn't let my countertransference act as a la Evie Schwaber, a retreat from the patient's vantage point of distress and upset about the Yankees losing the World Series. And again, I hope I haven't offended anyone here. All right, well, that's it for this week. Thank you, and we'll be moving on to the fourth and final week.